Hello and welcome to the second episode of our Property Damage Podcast series on the issue of flooding. I'm Jacob Broughton, a property damage solicitor at BLM, and today I'm joined by Richard Keightley, a senior associate at Hawkins, forensic investigators and expert witnesses. In this episode, Richard and I will be discussing the concept of property flood resilience and the benefits that it can provide for a property at risk of flooding. So hi Richard.
Hi Jacob, thanks for having me.
That's okay. We'll launch straight into the questions. So first of all, in a nutshell, what do we mean when we refer to property flood resilience?
So when we refer to property flood resilience, which is quite often shortened to PFR, so I'll refer to it as PFR today, we're talking about ways of making people and their houses less vulnerable to the impacts of flooding. PFR is a cost-effective way of reducing the impacts of flooding in areas where it might not be economic to build traditional engineered flood defence schemes. And it's also used to manage the residual risk of flooding in the event that traditional flood defences are overwhelmed or if they fail. And now PFR actually encompasses two different types of approaches. One is called recoverability, which is also often referred to as resilience, and the other is resistance.
It's an interesting point there. So what are the differences, the main differences between resiliency and resistance measures?
So houses are generally weatherproof, but they're not normally designed to withstand floodwater, and they're also not normally designed to be wet inside. So flood resistance measures involve making the house watertight to actually prevent floodwater from coming inside. So some examples of this are applying a waterproof layer to the external walls, which is known as tanking. Secondly, putting in floodproof external doors or putting in waterproof air brick covers and anti-flooding valves on drains. And it probably seems like common sense, but it's really important to stop up all of those potential pathways that water can get into a house. And flood resilience measures, on the other hand, involve using resilient building materials and methods to minimise the damage if floodwater does enter the house, and to accelerate the recovery process to get people back in their homes as quickly as possible. Some examples of this are using solid concrete floors with a tiled finish rather than timber and carpet, installing your electrical sockets higher up the wall, above the expected flood level, and even simple things like installing plasterboard panels horizontally rather than vertically.
Some good examples there of resistance and resilience measures. So if those measures are undertaken, how effective are these measures when done correctly?
Well, the short answer is, they can be very effective. So an example, in 2014, DEFRA carried out a review of the effectiveness of a number of PFR schemes. One of those schemes was led by the Environment Agency to install flood resistance measures, so preventing water getting into houses, on a number of homes in Lincolnshire. And the review showed that the floodwater was actually prevented from entering all of those houses where resistance measures had been installed in 3 separate flood events. And I'd also encourage listeners to check out the freely available Homeowner's Guide to Property Flood Resilience, which is available on the Know Your Flood Risk website. And that's got a bunch of case studies where resilient building methods have drastically reduced the damage caused by flood events and really shortened the amount of time that people were out of their flooded homes.
So we're aware of the Homeowner's Guide to Property Flood Resilience, and it's likely that was produced to answer a need. So in the past, has there been a reluctance to implement PFR measures, and if so, why?
Yeah, so PFR really started to kick off about 10 years ago when DEFRA and the Environment Agency started some grant schemes for its implementation. And being quite a new industry at the time, standards were kind of in their infancy. And unfortunately, some of the products and installers weren't quite up to scratch. And also the rush for funding meant a lot of installers didn't really take the time to understand the flood risk before installing the products. So an example is understanding the likely depth that flood water is going to reach outside your house. So resistance measures generally become impractical when your flood depths are above about 1/2 metre. Otherwise, if you try and keep flood water out deeper than that, it risks causing structural damage to the house. But thankfully, when those early grant schemes stopped a few years later, a lot of those less reputable companies left the market. But I think the biggest issue really has been a general lack of awareness of PFR and how effective it is. I've heard stories of resilient building materials being completely stripped out by contractors after a flood event when they could have just been dried out. And that just occurred because the house had changed owners since those measures were installed, and no one knew that they were actually resilient materials. So they did what they always did and just strip everything out. And unfortunately, a lot of recent studies have shown that the general perception among homeowners is that public authorities are responsible for protecting them and their property from flooding, and that homeowners can simply rely on insurance to pay for the cost of repairing their home after a flood. So very few homeowners are proactive about installing PFR, and those that do, they often only do so after they've been flooded once or twice or several times.
Okay, so what has changed now, and how do we build the confidence of insurers and their customers in PFR?
So DEFRA's recently consulted on plans to increase the funding available again for PFR implementation, which is really great news. And CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management, has recently been awarded a grant to deliver PFR training schemes for installers. And in the last 5 years or so, there's also been a lot of work in the industry to raise awareness generally about PFR and to develop guidance documents for its implementation, and also for British standards for flood protection measures. So we're in a much better position now to successfully implement PFR. And one example is the latest edition of the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience that was published earlier this year by Syria, and it really sets the standard for successful implementation of PFR.
That concludes our introduction to PFR, and I hope you found that and the discussion interesting and helpful. Richard, thank you for your time today in helping our listeners enhance their knowledge of PFR and the positive impact that they can have and will have upon our built environment.
Not a problem, Jacob. It's good to talk to you.
And you. It would be great to hear your observations and comments on the content of this episode, so please send them through to us at propertydamage@blmlaw.com. That's propertydamage@blmlaw.com. And thank you for listening to today's episode, and I hope that you can join us for our next episode on the Syria Code of Practice.